Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you.
Hey, wildlings. If you're interested in scaring people, the mechanics of atrocity do, in fact, matter. Such a story needs to be unreasonable enough that the reader can be horrified that someone is doing it, but reasonable enough that given the circumstances they can still see themselves capable of it. Continuing the crazy tonight, The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, parts 6 and 7. It turned cold the third week of September. An Arctic chill brought on a rapacious wind that stripped the trees of leaves in a handful of days. The cold necessitated a change of costume and a change of plan. Instead of walking, Julia took the car, drove down to the city center in the early afternoon, and found a bar in which the lunchtime trade was brisk, but not clamorous. The customers came and went, young Turks from the firms of lawyers and accountants debating their ambitions, parties of wine imbibers whose only claim to sobriety was their suits, and, more interesting, a smattering of individuals who sat alone at their tables and simply drank. She garnered a good crop of admiring glances, but they were mostly from the young Turks. It wasn't until she'd been in the place an hour and the wage slaves were returning to their treadmills that she caught sight of someone watching her reflection in the mirror. For the next 10 minutes, his eyes were glued to her. She went on drinking, trying to conceal any sign of agitation, and then, without warning, he stood up and crossed to her table. "Drinking alone?" he said. She wanted to run. Her heart was pounding so furiously she was certain that he must hear it, but no. He asked her if she wanted another drink, and she said she did. Clearly pleased not to have been rebuffed, he went to the bar, ordered doubles, and returned to her side. He was ruddy-featured and one size larger than his dark blue suit. Only his eyes betrayed any sign of nervousness, resting on her for moments only, and then darting away like startled fish. There would be no serious conversation, that she had already decided. She did not want to know much about him, his name if necessary, his profession and marital status if he insisted. Beyond that, let him be just a body. As it was, there was no danger of a confessional. She'd met more talkative paving stones. He smiled occasionally, a short, nervous smile that showed teeth too even to be real, and offered more drinks. She said no, wanting the chase over with as soon as possible, and instead asked if he had time for a coffee. He said that he had. "The house is only a few minutes from here," she replied, and they went to her car. She kept wondering as she drove, the meat on the seat beside her, why this was so very easy. Was it that the man was plainly a victim with his ineffectual eyes and his artificial teeth, born, did he but know it, to make this journey? Yes, perhaps it was that. She was not afraid because all of this was so perfectly predictable. As she turned the key in the front door and stepped into the house, she thought she heard a noise in the kitchen. Had Rory returned home early, ill perhaps? She called out. There was no reply. The house was empty. Almost. From the threshold on, she had the thing planned meticulously. She closed the door. The man in the blue suit stared at his manicured hands, waited for his cue. "I get lonely sometimes," she told him as she brushed past him. It was a line that she'd come up with in bed the previous evening. He only nodded by way of response, the expression on his face a mingling of fear and incredulity. He clearly couldn't quite believe his luck. "Do you want another drink?" she asked him, "or shall we go straight upstairs?" He only nodded again. "Which do you mean?" "I think maybe I've drunk enough already." "Upstairs, then." He made an indecisive move in her direction as though he might have intended a kiss. She wanted no courtship, however. Skirting his touch, she crossed to the bottom of the stairs. "I'll lead," she said. Meekly, he followed. At the top of the steps, she glanced round at him and caught him dabbing the sweat from his chin with his handkerchief. She waited until he caught up with her and then led him halfway along the landing to the damp room. The door had been left ajar. "Come on in," she said. He obeyed. Once inside, it took him a few moments to become accustomed to the gloom, and a further time to give voice to his observation. There's no bed. She closed the door and switched on the light. She had hung one of Rory's old jackets on the back of the door, and in its pocket she'd left the knife. He said again, "No bed." "What's wrong with the floor?" she replied. "The floor?" Take off your jacket. You're warm." "I am," he agreed, but did nothing. She moved across to him and began to slip the knot of his tie. He was trembling, poor lamb. Poor bleatless lamb. While she removed the tie, he began to shrug off his jacket. Was Frank watching this, she wondered? Her eyes strayed momentarily to the wall. Yes, she decided. He's there. He sees. He knows. He licks his lips and grows impatient. Then the lamb spoke. "Why don't you," he began, "why don't you maybe do the same?" "Would you like to see me naked?" she teased. The words made his eyes gleam. "Yes," he said thickly. "Yes, I would like that." "Very much?" "Very much." Now he was unbuttoning his shirt. "Maybe you will," she said. He gave her that dwarf smile again. "Is this a game?" he ventured. "If you want it to be," she said, and helped him out of his shirt. His body was pale and waxy, like a fungus. His upper chest was heavy, his belly, too. She put her hands on his face. He kissed her fingertips. "You are so beautiful," he said, spitting the words out as though they'd been vexing him for hours. "Am I?" "You know you are. Lovely. The loveliest woman I ever set eyes on." "Well, that's Gallant W," she said, and turned back toward the door. Behind her she heard his belt buckle clink and the sound of cloth slipping over skin as he dropped his trousers. So far and no farther, she thought. She had no wish to see him babe naked. It was enough to have him like this. She reached over and into the jacket pocket. "Oh, dear," the lamb suddenly said. She let the knife lie. "What is it?" she asked, turning back to look at him. If the ring on his finger hadn't already given his status away, she would have known him to be a married man by the underpants he wore, baggy and overwashed, an unflattering garment bought by a wife who had long since ceased to think of her husband in sexual terms. "I think I need to empty my bladder," he said. "Too many, whiskeys." She shrugged a small shrug and turned back to the door. "Won't be a moment," he said at her back, but her hand was in the jacket pocket before the words were out, and as he stepped toward the door, she turned on him, slaughtering knife in hand. His pace was too quick to see the blade until the very last moment, and even then it was bemusement that crossed his face, not fear. It was a short-lived look. The knife was in him a moment after, slicing his belly with the ease of a blade in overripe cheese. She opened one cut and then another. As the blood started, she was certain the room flickered, the bricks and mortar trembling to see the spurts that flew from him. She had a breath's length to admire the phenomena, no more, before the lamb let out a wheezing curse, and instead of moving out of the knife's range, as she had anticipated, took a step toward her, knocking the weapon from her hand. It spun across the floorboards and collided with the skirting, and then he was upon her. He put his hand into her hair and took a fistful. It seemed that his intention was not violence, but escape, for he relinquished his hold as soon as he'd pulled away from the door. She fell against the wall, looking up to see him wrestling with the door handle, his free hand clamped to his cuts. She was quick now, across to where the knife lay, up and back toward him in one fluid motion. He had got the door open by inches, but not far enough. She brought the knife down in the middle of his pockmarked back. He yelled and released the door handle. She was already drawing the knife out, plunging it into him a second time, and now a third, and a fourth. Indeed, she lost count of how many wounds she made. Her attack lent venom by his refusal to lie down and die. He stumbled around the room, grieving and complaining, blood following blood onto his buttocks and his legs. Finally, after an age of this farcical stuff, he keeled over and hit the floor. This time she was certain her senses did not deceive her. The room, or the spirit in it, responded with soft sighs of anticipation. And somewhere, a bell was ringing. Almost as an afterthought, she registered that the lamb had stopped breathing. She crossed the blood-spangled floor to where he lay and said, "Good enough?" Then she went to wash her face. As she moved down the landing, she heard the room groan. There was no other word for it. She stopped in her tracks, almost tempted to go back, but the blood was drying on her hands, and its stickiness revolted her. In the bathroom, she stripped off her flower-patterned blouse and rinsed first her hands, then her speckled arms, and finally her neck. The dousing both chilled her and braced her. It felt good. That done, she washed the knife, rinsed the sink, and returned along the landing without bothering to dry herself or to dress. She had no need for either. The room was like a furnace, and the dead man's energies pulsed from his body. They didn't get far. Already the blood on the floor was crawling away toward the wall where Frank was, the beads seeming to boil and evaporate as they came within range of the skirting boards. She watched, entranced, but there was more. Something was happening to the corpse. It was being drained of every nutritious element, the body convulsing as its innards were sucked out, gases moaning in its bowels and throat, the skin desiccating in front of her startled eyes. At one point, the plastic teeth dropped back into the gullet, the gums having withered around them. And in mere moments, it was done. Anything the body might have usefully offered by way of nourishment had been taken. The husk that remained would not have sustained a family of fleas. She was impressed. Suddenly the bulb began to flicker. She looked to the wall, expecting it to tremble and spit out her lover from hiding, but no. The bulb went out. There was only the dim light that had crept through the age-beaten blind. "Where are you?" she said. The walls remained mute. "Where are you?" Still nothing. The room was cooling. Her breasts had grown goose-flesh. She peered down at the luminous watch on the lamb's shriveled arm. It ticked away, indifferent to the apocalypse that had overtaken its owner. It read 4:41. Rory would be back any time after 5:15, depending on how dense the traffic was. She had work to do before then. Bundling up the blue suit and the rest of his clothes, she put them in several plastic bags, and then went in search of a larger bag for the remains. She had expected Frank to be here to help with this labor, but as he hadn't shown, she had no choice but to do it herself. When she came back to the room, the deterioration of the lamb was still continuing, though now much slowed. Perhaps Frank was still finding nutrients to squeeze from the corpse, but she doubted it. More likely, the pauperized body, sucked clean of marrow and every vital fluid, was no longer strong enough to support itself. When she had parceled it up into the bag, it was the weight of a small child, nothing more. Sealing the bag up, she was about to take it down to the car when she heard the front door open. That sound undammed all the panic she'd so assiduously kept from herself. She began to shake. Tears pricked her sinuses. Not now, she told herself, but the feelings would simply not be suppressed any longer. In the hallway below, Rory said, "Sweetheart?" Sweetheart. She could have laughed but for the terror. She was here, if he wanted to find his sweetheart, his honey bun with her breasts new washed and a dead man in her arms. "Where are you?" She hesitated before replying, not certain that her larynx was the equal of the deception. He called a third time, his voice changing timbre as he walked through into the kitchen. It would take him a moment only to discover that she wasn't at the cooker stirring sauce, and then he would come back and head up the stairs. She had 10 seconds, 15 at most. Attempting to keep her tread as light as possible for fear that he'd hear her movements overhead, she carried the bundle to the spare room at the end of the landing. Too small to be used as a bedroom, except perhaps for a child, they had used it as a dump. Half-emptied tea chests, pieces of furniture they'd not found a place for, all manner of rubbish. Here she laid the body to rest a while behind an upended armchair. Then she locked the door behind her just as Rory called from the bottom of the stair. He was coming up. "Julia? Julia, sweetheart, are you there?" She slipped into the bathroom and consulted the mirror. It showed her a flushed portrait. She picked up the blouse that she'd left hanging over the side of the bath and put it on. It smelled stale, and there was undoubtedly blood splattered between the flowers, but she had nothing else to wear. He was coming along the landing now. She heard his elephantine tread. "Julia?" This time she answered, making no attempt to disguise the tremulous quality of her voice. The mirror had confirmed what she'd feared, and there was no way that she could pass herself off as undistressed. She was obliged to make a virtue of the liability. "Are you all right?" he asked her. He was outside the door. "No," she said. "I'm feeling sick." "Oh, darling, I'll be fine in a minute." He tried the handle, but she had bolted the door. "Can you leave me alone for a little while? Do you want a doctor?" "No," she told him. "No, really. I wouldn't mind a brandy." "Brandy. I'll be down in 2 ticks." "Whatever the madam wants," he quipped. She counted his steps as he trudged to the stairs, then descended. Once she'd calculated that he was out of earshot, she laid back the bolt and stepped out onto the landing. The late afternoon light was failing quickly. The landing was a murky tunnel. Downstairs, she heard the clink of glass on glass. She moved as quickly as she dared to Frank's room. There was no sound from the gloomed interior. The walls no longer trembled, nor did distant bells toll. She pushed the door open, and it creaked slightly. She had not entirely tidied up after her labors. There was dust on the floor, human dust, and fragments of dried flesh. She went down onto her haunches and collected them up diligently. Rory had been right. What a perfect hausfrau she made. As she stood up again, something shifted in the ever denser shadows of the room. She looked in the direction of the movement, but before her eyes could make sense of the form in the corner, a voice said, "Don't look at me." It was a tired voice, the voice of someone used up by events, but it was concrete. The syllables were carried on the same air that she breathed. "Frank," she said. "Yes," came the broken voice. It's me." From downstairs, Rory called up to her. "Are you feeling any better?" She went to the door. "Much better," she responded. At her back, the hidden thing said, "Don't let him near me," the words coming fast and fierce. "It's all right," she whispered to him, then to Rory. "I'll be with you in a minute. Put on some music, something soothing." Rory replied that he would and retired to the lounge. "I'm only half made," Frank's voice said. "I don't want you to see me. I don't want anyone to see me. Not like this." The words were halting once more and wretched. "I have to have more blood, Julia." "More? And soon." "How much more?" she asked the shadows. This time she caught a better glimpse of what lay in wait there. No wonder he wanted no one to look. "Just more," he said, though the volume was barely above a whisper. There was an urgency in the voice that made her afraid. "I have to go," she said, hearing the music from below. This time the darkness made no reply. At the door, she turned back slightly. "I'm glad you came," she said, and as she closed the door, she heard a sound not unlike laughter behind her, nor unlike sobs. "Kirsty, is that you?" "Yes. Who's this?" "It's Rory." The line was watery, as though the deluge outside had seeped down the phone. Still, she was happy to hear from him. He called up so seldom, and when he did, it was usually on behalf of both himself and Julia. Not this time, however. This time, Julia was the subject under discussion. "There's something wrong with her, Kirsty," he said. "I don't know what it is." "Ill, you mean?" "Maybe. She's just so strange with me, and she looks terrible." "Have you said anything to her?" "She says she's fine, but she isn't." "I wonder if maybe she'd spoken to you?" "I haven't set eyes on her since your housewarming." "That's another thing. She doesn't even want to leave the house. Ever. That's not like her." "Do you want me to have a word with her? Would you?" "I don't know if it'd do any good, but I'll try." "Don't say anything about me talking to you, please." "Of course not. I'll call in at house tomorrow." "Tomorrow. It has to be tomorrow." "Yes, I know. I'm afraid I'll lose my grip, Julia. Start slipping back. I'll give you a call from the office on Thursday. You can tell me what you make of her." "Slipping back? They'll know that I've gone by now." "Who will?" "The Gash. The bastards that took me." "They're waiting for you?" "Just beyond the wall." Rory told her how grateful he was, and she in turn told him that it was the least a friend could do. Then he put down the phone, leaving her listening to the rain on the empty line. Now they were both Julia's creatures, looking after her welfare, fretting for her if she had bad dreams. No matter, it was a kind of togetherness. The man with the white tie had not bided his time. Almost as soon as he had set eyes on Julia, he came across to her. She decided, even as he approached, that he wasn't suitable. Too big, too confident. After the way the first one had fought, she was determined to choose with care. So when White Tie asked what she was drinking, she told him to leave her be. He was apparently used to rejections, and took it in his stride, withdrawing to the bar. She returned to her drink. It was raining heavily today, had been raining now for 72 hours on and off, and there were fewer customers than there had been the week before. One or two drowned rats heading in from the street, but none looked her way for more than a few moments. And time was moving on. It was already past 2. She wasn't going to risk getting caught by Rory's return again. She emptied her glass and decided that it was not Frank's lucky day today. She then slipped out of the bar and into the downpour, put up her umbrella, and headed back to the car. As she went, she heard footsteps behind her, and then White Tie was at her side, saying, "My hotel's nearby." "Oh," she said, and kept on walking, but he wasn't going to be shrugged off so easily. "I'm only here for 2 days," he said. "Don't tempt me," she thought. "I'm just looking for some companionship," he went on. "I haven't spoken to a soul." "Is that right?" He took a hold of her wrist, a grip so tight she almost cried out. That was when she knew she was going to have to kill him. He seemed to see the desire in her eyes. "My hotel?" he said. "I don't much like hotels. They're so impersonal." "Have you got a better idea?" he said to her. She had, of course. He hung his dripping raincoat on the hall stand, and she offered him a drink, which he welcomed. His name was Patrick, and he was down from Newcastle. "Down on business, but I can't seem to get much done." "Why's that?" He shrugged. "I'm probably a bad salesman, simple as that." "Well, what do you sell?" she asked him. "What do you care?" he replied, razor quick. She grinned. She would have to get him upstairs quickly before she started to enjoy his company. "Why don't we dispense with the small talk?" she said. It was a stale line, but it was the first thing that came to her tongue. He swallowed the last of his drink in one gulp and went where she led. This time she had not left the door ajar. It was locked, which plainly intrigued him. "After you," he said when the door swung open. She, of course, went first. He followed. This time she had decided there would be no stripping. If some nourishment was soaked up by his clothes, then so be it. She was not going to give him a chance to realize that they weren't alone in the room. "Going to fuck on the floor, are we?" he asked casually. "Any objections?" "Not if it suits you," he said, and clamped his mouth over hers, tongue frisking her teeth for cavities. There was some passion in him, she mused. She could feel him hard against her already. But she had work to do here, blood to spill and a mouth to feed. She broke his kiss and tried to slip from his arms. The knife was back in the jacket on the door, of course. While it was out of reach, she had little power to resist him. "What's the problem?" he said. "No problem," she murmured. "But there's no hurry either. We've got all the time in the world." She touched the front of his trousers to reassure him. Like a stroked dog, he closed his eyes. "You're a strange one," he said. "Don't look," she told him. "Huh?" "Keep your eyes closed." He frowned, but obeyed. She took a step backward toward the door and half turned to fumble in the depths of the pocket, glancing back to see if he was still blind. He was, and unzipping himself. As her hand clasped on the knife, the shadows growled. He heard the noise. His eyes sprang open. "What was that?" he said, reeling round and peering into the darkness. "It was nothing," she insisted, just as she pulled the knife from its hiding place. He was moving away from her across the room. "Well, there's somebody don't hear." That last syllable faltered on his lips as he glimpsed a fretful motion in the corner behind the window. "What in God's—" he began. As he pointed into the darkness, she was at him and slicing his neck open with a butcher's efficiency. Blood jumped immediately, a fat spurt that hit the wall with a wet thud. She heard Frank's pleasure and then the dying man's complaint, long and low. His hand went up to his neck to stem the pulse, but she was at him again, slicing his pleading hand, his face. He staggered, he sobbed. Finally, he collapsed, twitching. She stepped away from him to avoid the flailing legs. In the corner of the room, she saw Frank rocking to and fro. "Good woman," he said. Was it her imagination, or was his voice already stronger than it had been, more like the voice that she'd heard in her head 1,000 times these plundered years? The doorbell rang. She froze. "Oh, Jesus," her mouth said. "It's all right," the shadow replied. "He's as good as dead." She looked at the man in the white tie and saw that Frank was right. The twitching had all but ceased. "He's big," said Frank, "and healthy." He was moving into her sight, too greedy for sustenance to prohibit her stare. She saw him plainly now for the first time. He was a travesty, not just of humanity, of life. She looked away. The doorbell was ringing again, and for longer. "Go, answer it," Frank told her. She made no reply. "Go on," he told her, turning his foul head in her direction, his eyes keen and bright in the surrounding corruption. The bell rang a third time. "Your caller is very insistent," he said, trying persuasion where demands had failed. "I really think that you should answer the door." She backed away from him, and he turned his attentions to the body on the floor. Again, the bell. It was better to answer it, perhaps. She was already out of the room, trying not to hear the sounds that Frank was making. Better to open the door to the day. It would be a man selling insurance, most likely, or a Jehovah's Witness with news of salvation. Yes, she wouldn't mind hearing that just now. The bell rang again. "Coming," she said, hurrying now for fear that he leave. She had welcome on her face when she opened the door, but it died immediately. "Kirsty." "Well, I was just about to give up on you." I was asleep." "Oh." Kirsty looked at the apparition that had opened the door to her. From Rory's description, she'd expected a washed-out creature. What she saw was quite the reverse. Julia's face was flushed, strands of water-darkened hair glued to her brow, but she did not look like a woman who had just risen from sleep. A bed, perhaps, but not sleep. "I just called by," Kirsty said, "for a chat." Julia made a half shrug. "Well, it's not convenient just at the moment," she said. "I see. Maybe we could speak later on in the week?" Kirsty's gaze drifted past Julia to the coat stand in the hall. A man's gabardine hung from one of the pegs, still damp. "Is Rory in?" she ventured. "No," Julia said. "Of course not. He's at work." Her face hardened. "Is that what you came round for?" she said. "To see Rory?" "No, You don't have to ask my permission, you know. He's a grown man. You two can do what the fuck you like." Kirsty didn't try to debate the point. The volte-face left her dizzy. "Go home," Julia said. "I don't want to talk to you." She slammed the door. Kirsty stood on the step for half a minute, shaking. She had little doubt of what was going on. The dripping raincoat, Julia's agitation, her flushed face, her sudden anger. She had a lover in the house. Poor Rory had misread all the signs. She deserted the doorstep and started down the path to the street. A crowd of thoughts jostled for her attention. At last, one came clear of the pack. How would she tell Rory? His heart would break. She had no doubt of that, and she, the luckless tale-teller, she'd be tainted with the news, wouldn't she? She felt tears close. They didn't come, however. Another sensation, more insistent, overtook as she stepped onto the pavement from the path. She was being watched. She could feel the look at the back of her head. Was it Julia? Somehow she thought not. The lover, then? Yes, the lover. Safely out of the shadow of the house, she succumbed to the urge to turn and look. Within the damp room, Frank stared through the hole that he'd made in the blind. The visitor, whose face he vaguely recognized, was staring up at the house, at this very window, indeed. Confident that she could see nothing of him, he stared back. He had certainly set his eyes on more voluptuous creatures, but something about her lack of glamour engaged him. Such women were, in his experience, often more entertaining company than beauties like Julia. They could be flattered or bullied into acts that beauties would never countenance, and be grateful for the attention. Perhaps she'd come back, this woman. He hoped she would. Kirsty scanned the facade of the house, but it was blank. The windows were either empty or curtained, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Indeed, it was so strong that she turned away in embarrassment. The rain started again as she walked along Lodovico Street, and she welcomed it. It cooled her blushes and gave cover to the tears that would be postponed no longer. Julia had gone back up the stairs and found White Tie at the door, or rather, his head. This time, either out of an excess of greed or malice, Frank had dismembered the corpse. Pieces of bones and dried meat lay scattered about the room. There was no sign of the gourmet himself. She turned back toward the door, and he was there, blocking her path. Mere minutes had passed since she'd seen him bending to drain the energy from the dead man, but in that brief time he'd changed, out of all recognition. Where there had been withered cartilage, there was now ripening muscle. The map of his arteries and veins being drawn anew. They pulsed with stolen life. There was even a sprouting of hair, somewhat premature perhaps, given the absence of skin, on the raw ball of his head. None of this, of course, sweetened his appearance a jot. Indeed, in many ways, it worsened it. Previously there had been scarcely anything recognizable about him, but now there were scraps of humanity everywhere, throwing into yet greater relief the catastrophic nature of his wounding. There was worse yet to come as well. He spoke, and when he did, it was with a voice that was indisputably Frank's. The broken syllables had gone entirely. "I feel pain," he said. His browless, half-lidded eyes were watching her every response. She tried to conceal the queasiness she felt, but she knew the disguise inadequate. "My nerves are working again," he was telling her, "and they hurt." Well, what can I do about it? She asked him. Maybe some bandages. Bandages? Help me bind myself together. Well, if that's what you want. But I need more than that, Julia. I need another body. Another, she said. Was there no end to this? What's to lose? He replied, moving closer to her. At his sudden proximity, she became very anxious. Reading the fear in her face, he stopped his advance. I'll be whole soon, he promised her, and when I am... I'd better clear up, she said, averting her gaze from him. When I am, sweet Julia, Rory will be home soon. Rory, he spat out the name. My darling brother. How in God's name did you come to marry such a dullard? She felt a spasm of anger toward Frank. I loved him, she said, and then, after a moment's pondering, corrected herself. I thought I loved him. His laugh only made his dreadful nakedness more apparent. How can you have believed that? He said. He's a slug. He always was. Always will be. Never had any sense of adventure. Unlike you. Unlike me. She looked down at the floor. A dead man's hand lay between them. For an instant she was almost overwhelmed by self-revulsion. All that she'd done and dreamed of doing in the last few days rose up in front of her, a parade of seductions that had ended in death. All for this death that she had hoped so fervently would end in seduction. She was as damned as he was, she thought. No fouler ambition could nest in his head than presently cooed and fluttered in hers. Well, it was done. Heal me, he whispered to her, the harshness gone from his voice. Now he spoke like a lover. Heal me, please. I will, she said. I promise you I will. And then we'll be together. She frowned. But what about Rory? We're brothers under the skin, Frank said. I'll make him see the wisdom of this, the miracle of it. You don't belong to him, Julia, not anymore. No, she said, and it was true. We belong to each other. That's what you want, isn't it? It is what I want. You know, I think if I'd had you, I wouldn't have despaired so, he said to her. Wouldn't have given away my body and soul so cheaply. Cheaply? For pleasure, for mere sensuality. In you, here he moved toward her again. This time, his words held her, and she didn't retreat. In you, I might have discovered some reason to live. I'm here, she said. Without thinking, she reached across and touched him. The body was hot and damp. His pulse seemed to be everywhere, in every tender bud of each nerve, in each burgeoning sinew. The contact excited her. It was as if, until this moment, she had never quite believed him to be real. But now, it was uncontestable. He was uncontestable. She had made this man, or remade him, used her wit and her cunning to give him substance. The thrill she felt touching this too vulnerable body was the thrill of ownership. This is the most dangerous time, he told her. Before now I could hide myself. I was practically nothing at all. But not anymore. No, I've thought of that. We must be done with it, quickly. I must be strong and whole at whatever cost. You agree? Of course. After that, there'll be an end to the waiting, Julia. The pulse in him seemed to quicken at the thought. Then he was kneeling in front of her, his unfinished hands were at her hips, and then his mouth. Forsaking the dregs of her distaste, she put her hand upon his head and felt the hair, silken like a baby's, and the shell of his skull beneath. He had learned nothing of delicacy since last he'd held her, but despair had taught her the fine art of squeezing blood from stones. With time she would have love from this hateful thing. or she would know the reason why. So, wildlings, the next time someone tells you the heart wants what the heart wants, remember that there is a limit to everything. Stay scary, try not to off your spouse, even when familiarity breeds contempt, and make the most of your nights.